Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. I spy, you spy. A U.S. Diplomat has been expelled from Moscow. The ambassador summoned. We are talking about it with the Independent's Sean Walker, who joins us from Moscow. Here in the studio, France 24's Douglas Herbert. We have with us historian George Frederick Jewsbury. And from Kiev, Matthew Rojansky of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Matthew mentioning in part one of our discussion how Moscow and Washington have been in a hot and cold phase in its reporting on the story. The New York Times looking at the timing of this sting operation against that alleged spy, saying Mr. Putin has supported new laws to block Russian officials from depositing wealth overseas, saying doing so leaves them dangerously exposed to pressure from foreign governments. NGOs working in Russia are accused of meddling and are forced to register as foreign agents if they receive financing from abroad. Fair to say, Matthew Rojansky, that Moscow is becoming, how should we put this, more insular right now?
Well, I don't think that Moscow is becoming more insular. I mean, I spend a tremendous amount of time in that city, and I'll tell you that it has never been more global, it's never been more open, it's never been more prosperous than it is today. What's becoming more insular may be the mind of the Russian leadership, first and foremost of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who looks around him and he sees a society that may have supported him in last year's election, but just barely. He felt very much under assault. I think he still feels that way. Partly it is by what he considers to be a fifth column in his own society, and then partly it's by the Western world. And he's not wrong. It is true, as I mentioned in the last section, that if you ask any American official in an honest capacity, do you want to see Vladimir Putin continue as president of Russia? The answer is, of course not. There's an underlying desire to see regime change. Now, does that mean that Russia is Iraq? The United States is prepared to intervene in order to change the regime? Of course not. But that underlying understanding is not lost on Russian officials, certainly not on Vladimir Putin. And as a result, it undermines the ability of something like the reset, the idea that we should be simply pragmatically cooperating on shared interests, to become truly thoroughgoing and become foundational to a new kind of relationship. So the relationship is always going to be unstable because it exists on this foundation of mistrust. I think it's also very important to understand, particularly when you look at something like this spy scandal, that this is not a relationship of co-equals. Both in terms of geopolitical reach and weight today, the United States really is a global power, and Russia is at best a regional power, and it's a contracting power. That inequality, of course, leads Putin and others in Russia to feel that they always have to strike when the opportunity presents itself, that they can't be selective, they can't be sort of investing in long-term opportunities, putting forward trust and faith, and also that in Russia, and this is a long-term tradition, it comes from the Soviet past and even the Tsarist past, the state really controls almost every kind of international outreach, whether it's corporate investment, whether it's cultural dialogue, whether it's student exchanges. So you find this dramatic disconnect between Russians and Americans when they sit down in bilateral channels to try to work out ways to cooperate. The American side says, well, let's let the private sector do what they do. Let's let church groups do what they do. And to some extent, even, it's the pluralism of the American political system, let's let the intelligence folks do what they do. But the unintended consequences of all of those activities, and I would include in that the NGO human rights activism, often can undermine the political relationship in a way that the Russians simply don't understand. They see it all as being intentional. It's all part of high policy and politics coming from the White House. And if you understand the American system, that's simply not the case.
George Frederick Jewsbury, do Americans just don't get Russia?
Well, we have to go back to the beginning of the Cold War. The Americans have been rather adolescent in their view of the world. Raymond Aron wrote back in 47, 48 that the Americans are like people who fell in love for the first time and couldn't understand why the woman left. And there's this American capacity to project themselves on the rest of the world because, after all, it's the city on the hill. I'd like to bring something else up also within the Kremlin, and we're playing Kremlinology here. We have Mr. Surkov, who had been the political advisor of Mr. Putin for a long time, who set up really the system, departing. We have Sergeyakov, the head of the military reform, being replaced by Shoigu. And then the whole chain of people under Sergeyakov are being purged by Shoigu. So there's something going on.
So what you're saying is that Putin is more isolated than he was before?
Well, I think, there was this cliche a couple of years ago, the Siloviki against the Civilniki, and that is the old FSB people, KGB people against the technocrats. And I think that was overplayed. But there is something going on there when you see, especially Surkov stepping down, because he wasn't a kingmaker, but he certainly put the show on.
Sean Walker, how good are your Kremlinology skills?
Well, I think, it sometimes sounds a bit simplistic to point to Vladimir Putin's KGB background, but you have to remember this was a guy who started working in counterintelligence in St. Petersburg for the KGB. He doesn't read the internet. He reads what's put on his desk by the people below him and the people around him, many of whom are with that same background. And I've had people say to me that they think when Vladimir Putin says that he thinks the CIA is funding opposition groups in Russia and is sort of nudging the street protest that we saw, which was an allegation Putin made publicly. He's not just saying that for domestic consumption. There's part of him that actually believes that. So,
but but Sean, he's been in the Kremlin for more than a decade.
Well, he has, but I think if you look at who the people that were around Putin in 2000 or in 2004, and even the people who were around him in 2007, and the people who are around him now, it's quite a different group of people. As we've had the mention of Surkov, who is certainly no liberal Democrat, but he had a bit of had a nuanced view of politics. He was a clever guy. Even 4 years ago, I was talking to Voloshin, who was a Putin advisor in the first term, and he said there's nobody around Putin anymore who can say no to him, which was, it wasn't easy ever to say no to Putin, but there were those people who could say, hang on a minute. Now I'm not sure that those people are around him. He's mainly surrounded by, former intelligence people, by this hawkish element. The more liberal, the relatively more liberal people like Medvedev, who was president for a term and is now the prime minister, have been kind of marginalized. And yeah, I don't know what kind of information he's getting in those red folders that get put on his table, because he's certainly not reading his news from the internet like Dmitry Medvedev used to do.
Douglas Herbert.
No, I think it's extremely pertinent point. I think you can't sort of understate the impact and the influence on the person Vladimir Putin is of his KGB background. Because when you come from that background of those people, those are the people you trust. It's a certain type of culture. We talk all the time here in France about the French elite, the so-called the people who graduate from the ENA, the National Administration School, and they all become presidents and prime ministers. It's almost like the ex-KGB, now the FSB, as it's called. Those people, we all joke about them, the KGB and they're the stuff of Cold War spy novels and all of that, but they also happen to be a pretty clever bunch of people, a pretty talented, well-trained, very highly disciplined bunch of people. And when you come out of that cadre, those units of the KGB, it's a culture that you not only identify with, but you almost begin to exclusively trust. So, as Sean was saying before, that he doesn't read, he doesn't look at the internet, he doesn't read the Russian press. Well, the press to him is probably a joke. He really only trusts his own people. But at the same time, and this is what's interesting, is it is a more, we were talking about the changing circle of people around him. It's a more rarefied circle. I mean, among the elite, among the business elite, among the political elite, people are still, yes, he still can strike fear into the hearts of your average functionaries and bureaucrats and politicians. But they're also looking at Putin, and people in the back of their minds are wondering, they see the changes in society, and they're starting to calculate in the back of their minds, how long should they stay in his camp, stay on his side? There's a sort of subtle distancing going on.
Okay, so there's the Putin aspect of this, and then there's Barack Obama. Even before he was reelected, the U.S. president promised an outstretched hand to Moscow, his administration talking of the expression's been used on this set, hitting the reset button, like at a summit in March 2012 in South Korea.
My last election, yeah. After my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah, I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir and understand what
All right, the prime minister, well, actually, no, he was president still back then. Medvedev, I get him confused, saying he was going to transmit that information to Vladimir Putin. But
Must get moose and squirrel.
when the U.S. talks about hitting the reset button, what's the message that gets transmitted to Vladimir?
Well, I think we have to put this in a broader context, in that since the arrival of Obama, we've had the abandonment of the three basic planks of American foreign policy, which were erected in 1947, because Obama and his advisors changed the vocabulary. There is a pullback in the American side, and there is a desire to have, if not a Kissingerian division of power, at least an understanding between the two sides. And for the Americans to see this as very rational, given their limitations, Putin sees this as somewhat of an opportunity. Will he push it to the fact of going into Tallinn and invoking Article 5 of NATO? No, he won't do that. But you have this fracture zone from the Baltic down to the Black Sea, and you see this working with Rogozin, for instance, in Transnistria now. So there's something going on here. The Americans see this as a let's get along, let's do this, and I think Putin sees this as a great opportunity.
An opportunity. We are seeing it expressed in a different way. Last week, the U.S. Secretary of State was in Moscow, and him and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, have been talking about how they're singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to convening a conference in Geneva to sort out Syria.
What we need now is to mobilize support for this initiative on the basis of what was agreed in Geneva and what was proposed by Washington and Moscow.
That's what we're working towards. And I don't think it's insignificant that at this moment in time, we are finding this common ground and working closely together.
Sean Walker, is there a disconnect when you hear John Kerry's upbeat talk about how Moscow and Washington are working together on Syria, and of course the story you've been covering these last 24 hours?
Well, I'd say two things on that. I mean, the first thing is that I don't think it's true that John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov are very upbeat after their meetings in Moscow, including meetings with Putin. Kerry had and talked about progress and common ground and reading from the same page and so on. But actually, at the end of the day, all they've agreed to do is host a conference at an as yet unscheduled date with as yet unconfirmed parties. We don't know if the Assad's representatives are going to come. We don't know if the opposition are going to come. So it's not exactly like they've sort of, agreed a ceasefire and everybody's happy. The other thing I would say is that I do think the Russians are quite good at kind of compartmentalizing issues perhaps because of the cynical worldview that you might ascribe to Vladimir Putin and some of the people around him. I don't know, but I think they're quite good at being able to say, well, okay, well, on the spy front or on the Magnitsky list front or on the Victor Bout front, we're completely disagree with you. We're disgusted with your policies, but on these like 5 fronts, we can do business. So let's talk. I think maybe better than some other countries, Russia seems to be quite good at compartmentalizing those issues, sort of using the rhetoric when they're angry, but also still working behind the scenes on other things.
Matthew Rajansky, what do you see as the effect of all of this on the U.S.'s attempts to sway Russia to drop the Assad regime?
Look, I think Russia's openness to acknowledging that there's a common interest here, which, by the way, I think the Russians all along conceded and, in fact, sometimes emphasized to American officials that no one wants to see continued bloodshed in Syria, but that it had been a difference of approach. The Russians were particularly concerned that the United States was, as they feel that the United States did consistently over the last decade, underestimating the difficulty of the post-war scenario, of the post-regime change scenario, and in particular, underestimating the potential danger of the rise of Islamism in yet another Middle Eastern country. That's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where I don't yet see a really serious dialogue, even just between Washington and Moscow. Set aside actually bringing in the Syrian opposition. That would be very helpful. Figure out exactly who these people are, exactly what they can do, exactly what would happen if the United States, as has been suggested, really begins to arm and equip these people. These are the things that keep Russians up at night. There's no question about it. Russian experts have said it to me directly. So I don't think there's a fundamental difference here in basic interests. And that happens to be the case in a great number of issues across the board. One of your other panelists mentioned compartmentalization. Yes, it's true. The Russians have a greater ability, I would say, to play kind of Kissingerian realpolitik, and that's simply because they don't have to worry about politics. The United States, we've got to worry about politics, and the Senate makes statements and passes resolutions, and to some extent that becomes our foreign policy. But the bigger problem here is that while we might agree about basic strategic interests, after 2014, we do not want to see Afghanistan and Central Asia fall into total chaos and return to Taliban control. Does that mean that Russia's okay with the United States keeping bases in former Soviet republics in Central Asia? Absolutely not. This implicates broader questions. We don't have that dialogue with the Russians yet. And to bring it back to the issue of spying, there are reasons why we don't have the trust in order to have a real dialogue about these issues. That's what we've got to be building towards. And with each new American administration and each new Russian administration, you find a new approach, right? We're going to throw out what the last guy did. We're going to do it better ourselves, call it reset, call it Medvedev, whatever you want to call it. But we keep reinventing the wheel instead of making progress down the road.
And through all of this, Douglas Herbert, are the Americans perceived as weak by Moscow?
I don't think it's a matter of being weak. I think that, there's the same gap sometimes of misunderstanding that the Americans have of Russia and the Russians have of the Americans. I think a lot of the Russians might perceive the Americans as being naive at times, and I think that this spy scandal probably isn't helping the American case in that argument. But, one point here is that, we sort of, joke lightly about this spy scandal, at the same time talking about some of the consequences it may have or may not have on the relations. There's a reason that the U.S. continues to spy 20 years after the Cold War, a little more. And there's a reason that the Russians continue to spy on the U.S. because for all of this open dialogue, for all this compartmentalization we're talking about, let's talk about this, let's do this, let's open these fronts on this, we really don't know. I'm saying we in the sense of the Americans do not know really what the Russians are thinking a lot of the time on a lot of the big dossiers of du jour, so to speak, whether it's Iran, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Syria. If they're willing to pay $1 million to perhaps recruit a high-level security officer, it's because they want to know what's in those files that Sean was saying are being placed on Putin's desk. They have no idea. The realpolitik goes to such a point that it's newspeak. They really don't know. They can't get inside the Russians' minds. They want to know what they're thinking.
All right, what is Russia's true policy when it comes to Syria? Unfortunately, will have to be the topic of another debate. We are out of time, but I want to thank you, Douglas Herbert. I want to thank George Frederick Dewsbury, Matthew Rajansky for joining us from Kiev, and Sean Walker of The Independent for being with us from Moscow. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.